lice. Lice from the dust of the earth. Well, the Egyptians had a god named Geb. That was the god of the earth. So our God was saying, look, I'm taking the earth itself and I'm making lice and spreading it all over you. I have conquered that god. And of course, with every one of these people, it afflicted the people of Egypt too. It was saying that you are the ones who are conquered. There were swarms of flies. That was the next plague God sent. Khepri was the Egyptian god of creation. And Khepri had a human body and the head of a dung beetle. Of course, dung fertilizes the land. But dung is also something that flies feed on. And so God, by sending the flies, was saying, I have conquered Khepri. God turned ashes into boils and sores. Well, the Egyptians had a god named Isis, and Isis was the god of medicine and healing. And so God was saying, see if he can heal this one. God sent hail out of the sky. Well, Nut was the goddess of the sky. God had conquered that one. God sent locusts. Set was the god of the desert and the god who controls desert winds. Locusts always came out of the desert and they rode on the desert winds. God had conquered that god, Set. God sent 3 days of darkness and in so doing proved that he had conquered Ra, the god of the sun. I'm not letting you shine today, Ra. And then the 10th one, the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh's son was killed by that plague. And Pharaoh was considered the highest of all the gods of Egypt. And his son would be a god. God killed the next god of Egypt. But there's one more plague I didn't mention yet, and that was the 5th plague, the death of the cattle and livestock. God killed all the cattle and livestock. And so when Moses took his time on the mountain, and he was up there and there was the lightning and the cloud and the thunder, he took his time and they got impatient. They made a golden calf. Well, the 5th plague was a death of all the cattle and all the calves. And so God was showing that he had conquered Hathor, goddess of love and protection and joy and celebration. And also the bull god, the male cow, the bull god, was a symbol of Pharaoh. So people were saying, we want a God who will go before us. Who's that? It's a God who will bring us love and protection and joy and celebration. And he symbolizes Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was so good to us, wasn't he? What was wrong with these people? Moses was late. That's all that happened. He was a little bit late. And for that, they threw away all the miracles. And they went back to things that actually oppressed them. Now, as a counselor, I know what makes people tick. I know why they do the things they do. And so I looked at where the Israelites had come from. They had been slaves for 400 years. Now, generation after generation after generation, slaves, working in the relentless heat. Maureen and I used to live in Florida, and when I had to mow the lawn, I would come in every 10 minutes gasping for breath and standing in front of the swamp cooler. They didn't have a swamp cooler back then. I just can't imagine what it was like for them to work in the hot Egyptian sun, which is probably a lot worse than Florida. Many of them, I'm sure, could not choose their own education, their own career. On top of all that, and just having no freedoms, no Bill of Rights, there came a time when there were too many of them, and so the Egyptians decided, we're going to kill all the baby boys. This is what they wanted to go back to. And so it's easy to see why they felt like God isn't there for us. People we counsel, Maureen and I counsel, when they go through a lifetime of just being in this place where they can't do anything about their circumstances, and they're just totally helpless. They end up making what we call inner vows, and they believe lies in their hearts. Inner vows are just a promise you make that this is what I'm going to do to keep the pain away. And they believe in lies in their hearts, and so they start believing things like, I'm not going to believe that God will ever send somebody who's good to me. We'll see a woman, for instance, who comes to us and says, why is it that there's all these wonderful men who come my way, and they're good, and they are protective, and they're sweet, and they're loving. They're just like Moses. And yet, every day, every guy I choose to date is a bad boy who ends up abusing me. Because a long time ago, she just decided it's too painful to keep waiting and waiting and waiting for something good to happen, for some nice guy to come along, because I grew up under a father who was abusive and who never repented. And so I just won't believe that any such man exists. And she believed that lie so firmly that when God sends the miracles, he sends these sweet men who are protective and loving and upstanding, the miracle doesn't sink in. Or a child grows up under neglect, and he just keeps waiting and wanting for somebody to pay attention to me. Tell me I'm a good kid. Tell me you love me. And it never happens, and so finally he just decides, I'm just not going to believe that anybody will care about me. And then every time somebody comes along who gives them a compliment or says something that says, I like you, it doesn't register. And so God proved himself. And he often does the most miracles for those who've been through the most suffering. He's saying, let me prove myself. So this was the most suffering generation in all of Egypt's history, or Israel's history. Well, Egypt's too, eventually, because they went through the 9 plagues. But the most suffering generation in Egypt's history. Not only were they slaves for 400 years, but their little baby boys were being killed. And then they were told, you can't even have straw to make your brick with. Just make it out of mud. And so God tried to prove himself by giving them the best miracles. Now, when we look at the Egyptians, I'm sure many of you have said, what was wrong with those people, right? Like, how could anybody have that kind of miracles and say, let's make a golden calf and go back to Egypt? We don't apply the Exodus to ourselves. We don't compare ourselves to them and say, yeah, I could do that. We think, if I saw all those miracles, I'd be one of the people who believed. Well, if that's true, then why was it that only out of an entire generation of people, only 2 entered the promised land? 2 people. Out of how many? I don't know how many were in. I don't think does the Bible say exactly how many were in the desert who came out of Israel, of Egypt? A lot of people speculate it might have been 1 million. Even if it was just tens of thousands, 2 is not very many. And so Exodus shows us just how hard it is to rise above the slave mentality. And so we need to know how do we rise above this? There came a point where I started to believe that I was just like them. Because I would despair. God did all these wonderful things, but I would despair. And one day, I was doing my typical despairing and saying, where's God? It feels like he's not there for us. And Maureen said to me, and this was early in our marriage, she said, what are you talking about, Mark? Just sometime this week I heard you talking about a miracle that had happened this week. And I thought, I'd forgotten about that. Can't remember what it is now. But I had forgotten about that. And she began to remind me of several other things God had done for me, and I realized I'd forgotten about so many things, and that when hard times come, even the small things, I'd forget all those wonderful things. So, like I've said before, when I've been here, I began to write them down, and I realized as I wrote there were more and more and more that I'd forgotten about. Big ones, little ones, like the time when I had a dream one night, and I dreamed there was a guy I was counseling in real life who was very off balance, and he was coming to shoot me. And I woke up and I said, Maureen, I don't know if this is symbolic or literal. Most dreams are symbolic, but let's just pray for protection. And Maureen prayed and I prayed. And later that day, the guy's girlfriend called and said, I just want to warn you, my boyfriend is talking about getting a gun and coming and shooting you. Somehow we managed to get the guy to our pastor and he cast a demon out. And it's a good thing we had one like Steve Watson, who knows what to do with demons. And the Lord just kept doing thing after thing for us, protected us from an 84 car accident. Our daughter, Mikal, was almost kidnapped twice. And the Lord warned us ahead of time it would happen. And both times we saw the kidnappers and we could tell what they were up to, but the Lord made them flee. And just recently I saw that movie called The Sound of Freedom, and it really drove home what God had protected us from. I mean, what if that had happened? We could have gone for months, years, maybe the rest of our lives, wondering what country is Mikal in and what is going on with her. And I can't remember if I told you this one, but in one of them, I just want to say it because it just showed what lengths God went to show me that he was going to do everything and I didn't have to do anything. I was at work one day and I just felt like I was supposed to share this one. I was at work one day and I just suddenly had a sense that Maureen had taken Mikal and Joshua to the mall. No, Mikal and Jonah. Joshua wasn't born yet. And Mikal was 4 years old, and I just had a sense that there was a kidnapper there who wanted to kidnap Mikal. And so I said, Lord, what do I do? Do I go to the mall to warn her? I had somebody coming 10 minutes from then for counseling, and I asked the Lord, what do I do? They were driving 45 minutes to get there. Do I just go and warn Maureen and have them go back home again and come again another time? I felt like the Lord said, no, don't do that. Just trust me that I will take care of it. Just pray that God will send somebody to warn Maureen, somebody else, and that he'll have other people pray. And so Maureen at the end of the day said, yeah, there was this strange guy following us around the mall. And suddenly, he had his eye on Mikal. And Maureen knew what she was up to. And suddenly somebody showed up and said, God told me to come and warn you because there's danger here at the mall. He told me you were at the mall. And 20 minutes later, somebody else came and said, God told me you were at the mall, and I came to warn you there's danger. And somebody else later said, God told me you were at the mall, but I couldn't make it there because I didn't have a car with me, and so I prayed for you. And so the Lord was saying, you don't have to do anything. I'm protecting you. And I'd always wondered, why did God let me be molested when I was 4 years old, or 5 years old, by 4 teenage boys? I'm still not quite sure, but sometimes the Lord doesn't tell you why things happen, as with Job. But he does give you enough miracles in your life to show you that something good came out of it, and he had some reason for allowing it. And I looked at those two miracles, the times when Mikal was not kidnapped, and I thought, that would have been so much worse than what happened to me. And yet, it didn't sink in. God can do amazing things for you, and it just doesn't sink in. I would think, my attitude, my feeling was just, well, that was nice. But I thought, where's the excitement? Where's the something inside me that says, wow, look what God did for me? It wasn't there. And I didn't know why. It wasn't until I'd written down many, many, many of these things that God had done for us that it began to sink in. And for the first time, I thought, I am just like the Israelites in the desert. Because every time that any little thing would happen, I'd begin to say, Lord, where are you for us? And I began to realize why the miracles didn't sink in for the Hebrews because they had not sunk into my heart. I looked at the Hebrews and I thought every generation of the Hebrews had a bad childhood to some degree. They had nothing to look forward to, no education, no career, no wonderful things. They had to look forward to just working in the hot desert sun and not being appreciated by the people who made them do it, not being rewarded. And then I looked at my own life and I thought when I was 5, I was molested by 4 teenage boys who said that if I told anybody, they would kill my parents. And so I never told them, and I just made myself forget about what happened, and I carried pain alone. And when you do that, you start making those inner vows. I'm not going to believe there's anybody there for me. I'm not going to believe that anything is going to happen to take the pain away. And when you do that, all the emotions are stuck inside and they start leaking out in weird ways, and you do awkward things. And on top of that, I was on the autism spectrum. And so I didn't have any social skills. And I had absence seizures. It's a type of epileptic seizure where your brain shuts off and your eyes go glassy, and then you come back again. And you miss portions of conversation because you do that, because you're gone. And my parents didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what autism was back then, autism spectrum anyway. They didn't know what that was. They didn't know what ADD was back when I was a kid. I had that. And so I was just out of it, spacey, gone, and they thought I was just choosing to go into a dream world, so snap out of it. And back then, they didn't know inner healing yet, and so they tried to criticize and shame me out of it. And the molesters, when they molested me, they called me a pretty little girl, and so I just was so confused about myself that I became so feminine, people didn't know if I was a girl or a boy back then. And so I'd be scolded at home to snap out of it, and I'd go to school and be called names all day long. I even had a PE teacher who called me Susie in front of the class, and so the whole school called me that. And then I'd go home and I'd be shamed, and I'd go to school and I'd be called names, and people thought I was weird. And so like God did with the Israelites, God started giving us miracle after a miracle, and I just kept writing them down. And there have been so many times when I just felt so discouraged, and I said, Lord, I need some encouragement. And I just felt like the Lord said, pray that so-and-so in this state far away will give you a word of encouragement. And the next morning, I'd get a text from that person with a word of encouragement. God kept trying to prove himself. Finally, after many more of these, and I just kept writing these things down, I began to know in my heart that God was there for me. I didn't feel it yet, but I began to kind of know it. And after many more of them, I began to feel that God was with me, just a little bit. Not great excitement, but I felt something. And as I was preparing this teaching, I began to realize how many things had happened that I didn't call miracles, things I explained as coincidences or through some natural explanation. Like when I was younger, I was so forgetful, because when you have autism spectrum and when you have ADD at the same time, you forget all the time. And so I would just keep forgetting and forgetting and forgetting to put gas in the car. And so what would happen is, I would just remember I've got to put gas in the car, and oh no, it's way down at the bottom of empty. And I'd just pray, Lord, please get me to the gas station. And I would get to the gas station and suddenly run out of gas as I was entering the gas station and coast to the gas pump. And now, if that just happened once, it's a coincidence, or twice or 3 times, but it happened over and over and over again. There were a couple times when there was another car at the pump, and so I just had to stop the car. And when the other car left, I got out and pushed it the rest of the way. And there were kind people who helped me do it. There were times even just as recently as about 15 or 20 years ago, when I was traveling for Elijah House, and we flew to Cape Town, and we stopped in Atlanta, and we had a layover, kind of a long layover, and I couldn't keep track of time. That's another part of the whole thing with autism, ADD. I couldn't keep track of time. And so I thought, well, there's lots of time but in this layover. I'm going to go and visit all the other stores, and then I finally realized it was time to get back, and I got back. And I got back so late, the plane should have left. Everybody was angry at me, but you know what? There was a little $7 piece of the plane that didn't work right, and they had to fix it. And so the plane was delayed, and God held up 300 or 400 people just for me. And it happened again when I was on my way back, I think on the way to either to or from Vienna. And I stopped in Copenhagen. I had a layover, and there's plenty of time to get on the tram and go downtown and see a little bit of the downtown Copenhagen. And again, I couldn't keep track of time, and I got back, but guess what? There was this little piece of the plane that didn't cost much, but they had to fix it, and 150 passengers had to wait for me, but I still got on the plane. It's like God's always saying, I got your back, I got your back. When I was a kid, when I was in middle school, they had a fight in school just about every day, over and over and over. But nobody ever picked a fight on me. Now, they called me names, and that was cruel, but nobody picked a fight on me. And you know why? Because I was the smallest kid in school. Well, with the exception of one other girl who was the same height I was. When I was in the 7th grade, I was 4'4". When I was in the 8th grade, I was 4'6". When in the 9th grade, I got up to 4'9". And nobody ever picked a fight on me because everybody would be ashamed to be called the one who picked a fight on the littlest kid in the school. But then, when I went into high school, the hippie days came. And, everything was love and peace. We're the love and peace generation. And make love, not war. And nobody was fighting anymore. And so suddenly, in high school, I grew 13 inches. And, I'm the only person in my whole family line, who was that short during my earlier teen years. And I never thought of it, but I thought, wait a minute. I think that God must have done that. He put it into my genes knowing what was going to happen. He has my back. How often do we hear things that we hear it all the time? We hear things like happening like, a guy I heard about, a friend of mine, a Christian friend of mine, was shot by accident on a hunting trip. It was a hunting accident, and the bullet missed his spine by 1/16 of an inch and 1/16 of an inch over, and he would have been paralyzed, but turns out he can recover. You hear that kind of thing all the time, don't you? Or somebody says, my Aunt Mabel, she was in a car accident, and if she had been 1 foot to the right, it would have been a head-on collision, but as it is, she just kind of got sideswiped. She came out of it okay. We hear about those things all the time, and we call them coincidences, don't we? Now, there are coincidences, but I think there's a lot less of them than we think. Even on the news, in the headlines, you see, man miraculously saved from death in explosion. And you think, okay, they're using that as a metaphor. Why can't they believe it? That it really was a miracle. So how do you let go of the slave mentality? Here's a few things, and we're going to pray it through in a few minutes. Repent of the expectations you've got. There's something that in the language of inner healing we call a bitterroot expectation. Nobody is there for me. That was the expectancy of the entire Israelite people. They had this bitterroot expectancy. Nobody's there for me. So God can be there for him over and over and over and over. And Moses can be there for him over and over and over. And then some little thing happens. Like, for instance, Moses is too late getting back. And God and Moses are not there for us. And we go back to Egypt, to the gods that were there, the people who oppressed us. Like like the lady who grew up under abuse, and we put on these lenses, and all we can see is oppression. And when the love and the miracles come our way, we cannot see them. And see, she goes right back to the bad boys who beat her up. So ask God what the Bitterroot expectancy is for you. Is it nobody's going to notice me? Nobody will protect me. People will assume the worst about me. Maureen, there were times, so many times when I would speak and it would go well, and all sorts of people would say it went really well, but I would find one little mistake in it, and I would just obsess about it. And she'd say, what are you doing, Mark? That's all you can see is the little thing you did wrong. Like, take the glasses off and let the love in that people have given you, the affirmation. Second thing is to fight to stop the negative talk. We find that sometimes when people come to us for counseling and we pray about roots of bitterness, we take the lenses off and we get rid of their Bitterroot expectancies. We nail them on the cross. Sometimes that's enough because that satisfies the law of sowing and reaping. There's something planted in our heart that we're reaping. It comes to an end on the cross, but there are times when that doesn't happen. So sometimes people get healed so fast, and sometimes, no matter how many roots they pray about, the problems, the sadness, the despair still goes on. I've discovered that complaining can be an addiction. Not just a habit, an addiction. And you know something's an addiction when it is so powerful that you would be willing to sacrifice anything for it. So you know what drug addicts are like, or alcoholics. Sometimes a person will be willing to sacrifice their marriage for their high. Doesn't matter how much it hurts their family, they'll sacrifice their marriage for it. Maybe they'll come to work too many times high or drunk and they get fired. They sacrifice their career for it. They sacrifice their friendships for it. They end up in the gutter with a bottle of beer in their hand. They'll sacrifice their whole life for it. Well, look what the Hebrews did. For people who feel powerless, sometimes the only power they find is complaining. They at least get a high out of complaining. And with the Hebrews, they couldn't even complain to the Egyptians, so they just complained to each other or to themselves. And it almost becomes like a mantra. We repeat it over and over. Listen to what the Egyptians, I keep confusing the two, but I don't know. They're kind of the same. Listen to what the Israelites said. Exodus 14:11. In Exodus 14:11, first part of the verse, it says, "And then they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" Like God has protected them so many times, separating them from the army of Egypt by the cloud by day and the pillar by night, and swallowing up the greatest army on earth for them in the Red Sea. But you just brought us here to die. They're wearing the lenses, and they're just seeing everything through it. Exodus 16:3. Exodus 16:3. "Why have you brought us out into this wilderness to kill this entire assembly with hunger?" Numbers 20, verse 4. "Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here?" Numbers 20, verse 4. Numbers 21, verse 5. 21, verse 5. "Why have you brought us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food, no water, and we're disgusted with this miserable food. All we get is manna. All we get is a miracle every day of our lives." I mean, that's how extreme it gets. I mean, you take an addict, you just shake him and say, "Wake up, you don't see what you're throwing away." After a lifetime of this kind of addiction, we live as if God hasn't proven himself or done anything. No miracles. And so in Numbers 14:2, it says, after learning about the Nephilim in Canaan, they'd sent spies into Canaan, and the spies came back and said, well, there's some giants over there. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses. All of them. Every one of them. Except for, of course, Caleb and Joshua and Moses. All the sons grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the entire congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Or only if we had died in this wilderness. So why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Like, okay, excuse me. Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? They had not given up their Bitterroot expectancy. They had not repented of it. They had not repented of the complaint and fought against the addiction of complaint. And they didn't acknowledge what God had done for them. So in Egypt, Israel had to work in the hot sun. In the desert, they couldn't farm. They couldn't hunt. They didn't have to work at all. They couldn't raise any food. It just fell out of the sky. They couldn't find water. It came out of a rock. They couldn't protect themselves. But God drowned the army of Egypt in the sea for them. The Lord put me in a place where I could not do anything for myself. There came a time when I was on sabbatical with the ministry I was with before, and they sent an email saying, we're sorry, we can't give you a salary anymore because we are low on funds. And so suddenly Maureen and I had nothing to live on. This was 5 years ago. And later on I lost my job as well. But three weeks into it, the Lord worked miracles. When we lost our income, I said, Maureen, what do we do? Should we advertise that we can counsel people? Should we say something on Facebook so that we could get people to come our way? Should we network? And she said, no, I think God says just do absolutely nothing at all and just wait for the phone to ring. So I said, okay. I had learned to trust God enough to know that Maureen is right when she says these things. And within 3 weeks, we had a full income. And not long after that, this pastor came to us named Steve Watson, and he said, and we didn't even know who he was, but he came to us and said, God has told me what happened. And he prophesied to us and told us everything that had happened to us. And he said, God has told me we need to help support you by having you come down to our church periodically and counsel and preach. You're going to say something, love?
I am, but I'll let you finish.
Go
And
ahead.
we were counseling you guys.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to cut you off, but with the complaining, I just wanted to say, Mark and I have been learning this together for a long while because both of us have struggled for many years. And I am a huge complainer, and I complain out loud, mostly to Mark. But what complaining did for me was my motive for doing it was to make him feel bad. I always wanted to make him feel bad, and I wanted him to feel sorry for me. And that's really what it was about. And I mean, I don't know what else to say, but I just wanted to make you feel bad.
And it was a way to say, I don't believe you will love me unless I complain enough. You see, we don't let the love in, we don't let the miracles in.
And I made sure that I did it away from the kids so they wouldn't hear it. I did it privately to him, and I would beat him down with it.
And it was easy to do because I was addicted to complaining about myself. And what a bad person I was. And so We repented of the bitter expectancies. We've been repenting about the complaining. And we've realized how helpless we are without God. And, in the last 5 years, God has orchestrated everything. Everything. I mean, we need money, somebody shows up with it. We need a volunteer, somebody just shows up. We haven't done it. We have never planned a single thing in the last 5 years. Somebody let us use the film they used when they recorded us at their church doing the deliverance seminar. And it was on the East Coast. It didn't turn out well because the young guy who was doing it was an assistant who was left in charge because the main guy was gone. And so I said, Lord, it would be so nice if you would send some wealthy person to give us a chunk of money that we could use for filming. And then 2 days later, a friend from California who's very wealthy called up and said, can I give you some money so you can film? And then this pastor named Steve Watson invited us to go to the Patria gathering. And Michael French was there, and Michael French said, hey, I'd like you to come and speak. And so we said, well, we got this seminar, and is it okay if we pay somebody to come and film it? He said, oh, no, it's okay. My son will film it for free, and he's a professional cinematographer, and he has a whole team. So God he keeps taking care of us and proving himself over and over and over again.
It's almost embarrassing listening to this because we did nothing but complain all the time.
Yes.
Mark hated himself and hated all the little things he did wrong, and I hated him and complained about everything he did wrong, and it was just on and on and on and on all the time.
And so that's what I've realized through all this time. I thought, my gosh, almost all of us are like this to some extent or another. And only Caleb and Joshua got into the promised land. That's it. All of that entire generation, thousands and thousands, perhaps 1 million people, did not get into the promised land. Only them. And I began to pray, Lord, please help me to fight this addiction of complaint. And help me, Lord, to enter the promised land. It says in Numbers 32, verse 11 through 12, and I'm condensing it a bit, 32, 11 through 12. Surely none of the men who come out of Egypt from 20 years old and above shall see the land, because they have not wholly followed me except Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua must have repented of any bitterroot expectancies they had. They must have fought not to complain. And they must have allowed the miracles into their heart. And for that reason, it says in Joshua 14:11, in Joshua 14:11, it says, here I am this day, Joshua said, I am 85 years old, and I am as strong this day as I was on the day that Moses sent me. And after 40 years, it means he started out at 45 in the wilderness. Just as my strength was then, so is my strength for war. There's something happens when you let the miracle into your heart. When you let God prove himself and you let it sink in. It says in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But you have to let yourself be strengthened.
Yes, and I want to share something with you that probably some people know in the church, but most don't. I have had COPD for 20 years, many years.
COPD is cardiopulmonary disorder, right?
It's a breathing problem. It's chronic emphysema, chronic bronchitis. Basically, your lungs start to weaken. I had very weak lungs, and I smoked as a young girl. And just things compounded, so my lungs were just really sick. And so about, not even 6 months ago, I was having a lot of trouble breathing, and they couldn't find some good medicine for me. I found out I have stage 3 emphysema. So my lung capacity is way down in the 20s and 30s. It's very low. And so Mark and I are at the doctor. He told me I had to be on oxygen all the time. Well, we were just absolutely devastated. We went home. I sat in my living room.
And complain.
And the oxygen man comes in his truck to deliver all these things for me. And I was devastated. My kids were devastated and everything. And so I just, what do? You just listen to the doctor and go with it. So he gave me some new medicines. I've tried a million, but he gave me some new and said, you have to be on oxygen all the time. I thought, I'm not going out of the house with an oxygen tank. And it was horrifying to Mark, too. And we're both looking at each other, oh no, Maureen's going to die, crying in the kitchen. You know, it was that bad. And I started taking the oxygen, and I started feeling really good. And I started doing it all night long, where I just hooked myself up and breathed it in all night long, and I'd wake up, and I started feeling better and better and better and better. And he gave me this new medicine and spaced it out during the day, so I feel even normal. I would forget that I had this issue. So anyway, what I'm trying to say, I feel so incredibly grateful for my oxygen tank. It's not something I have to do all the time. A few times a day and at nighttime, and I feel pretty normal most of the time. I can't do a lot of strenuous things like high impact exercise like I used to, but I feel so good. And I realized God knew I'd been so oxygen deprived for so many years. It's like he gave me a brain boost or something. So the gratitude that goes with something like that kind of blew my mind, because I pretty much hated God when I walked out of the doctor's office. How could you do this to me? But I've changed. My kids have seen a change in me. I'm not as mean to Mark anymore. Basically, I want to say gratitude comes in strange ways, and God's miracles come in strange ways, but that was a miracle for me.
So sometimes God totally heals you, and sometimes he makes the medicine stretch beyond belief.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still praying for total healing, but hey.
It doesn't matter to me anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
So I want to have you pray through some things. So, and Keziah and Paul said they were going to come up, play some soft music while we're going through this. I want you to get quiet, and I want you to listen to God for just a couple minutes. A lot of you have been through times in your life where there was so much pain, so much trauma, that you developed an expectancy. And the expectancy might have been, nobody's going to be there for me. God's not going to heal me. God's not going to come through. I'll always be overlooked. Just listen to the Lord and ask the Lord, what have I learned to expect? Instead of expecting that somehow he's going to come through. What have I learned to expect? Just give it a listen. We'll pray about that in a minute. forgive me for what I have expected. Gotta pray out loud. Forgive me for what I have expected. Can't hear you guys. Let's try it one more time. Lord, forgive me for what I have expected.
For what I have expected.
Take off the glasses.
Take off the glasses.
Let me see you as you are.
Let me see you as you are.
Lord, forgive me for the complaints.
Lord, forgive me for the complaints.
Give me the strength to fight them.
Give me the strength to fight them.
I want you to just listen just one more minute and ask the Lord, what are my common complaints that are like mantras that I say over and over? Just imagine putting those complaints into a bowl and dump them at the feet of the cross. And repeat after me. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Lord, I ask you for everybody here to let the miracles sink in. And I want you to, I told you this before, but I want you to write them down. All the good things God has done for you, write them in a file in your computer or in a notebook. Write them down and read them now and then, and ask the Lord as you read them, let them sink in. Let me feel it. Let it have its impact on my heart so that I can believe that just as you did all those miracles for me in the wilderness, when I go into the promised land, you will do miracles